In early October, unscheduled inspections were underway at a private shipyard in the coastal town of Hitotsubashi. Due to winds and humidity, some equipment required maintenance. Technician Yasuhiro Kobayashi worked in the inspection area and was valued for his precision and habit of completing his shift on schedule. Even when working overtime, he rarely acted spontaneously. His colleagues believed that he avoided unnecessary conversations and almost never changed his route home. He usually left through the main passage and walked along the illuminated street. One evening, Kobayashi stayed late after his shift, and cameras at the entrance recorded him leaving later than usual and heading through the parking lot to the far edge of the grounds. Instead of his usual route, he turned onto a service path that led to an old pier and a dilapidated embankment that had been closed after a storm several years earlier. This pier was considered a dead-end area. There were no residential buildings or shops there, and in the evenings, even fishermen rarely appeared there because of the slippery concrete and darkness. Access to the trail was not formally blocked, but the lighting quickly faded, and beyond began a section without cameras, so any movement there usually went unnoticed. The recording shows that Kobayashi moved steadily, without stopping or attempting to call. He did not look back or change his pace, as if he already knew where he was going. There were no reports of conflict at work that day, and the shift supervisor confirmed that Kobayashi had completed his tasks and had not expressed any concerns. There were no accidents recorded in the pier area, no storm warnings were issued, the water level remained normal, and weather conditions did not appear dangerous. After he left the illuminated area, the connection with his phone became unstable, and data was updated less frequently and with delays. The device's last reliable mark referred to the border of the old embankment. Further coordinates either did not appear or were too inaccurate to reconstruct the route. There were no security guards patrolling the pier that night, and the service area was considered closed to visitors, but was of no interest to security. By morning, Kobayashi had not shown up at home. He had not contacted or responded to the usual morning messages, which was unusual for the family. His wife initially assumed that he had stayed late at work or had fallen asleep at a friend's place, but an investigation revealed that he had not returned to the company and that his shift had already ended. In the first half of the day, relatives contacted colleagues. It turned out that Kobayashi had left alone and had not communicated his plans. No one had seen him get into the car. After this, the family contacted the police, and their report was accepted immediately because documents, money, and work records remained at home, and no signs of voluntary departure were found. The group's initial outing began with an inspection of the parking lot and the entrance to the service trail, where they expected to find a simple explanation, such as an accidental fall or injury. Footprints matching Kobayashi's size were found on the damp ground at the start of the trail. They led toward the pier and then onto old concrete. Already at this stage, it became clear that events were not developing as in ordinary cases, because next to his footprints, there were separate prints of other shoes that could not be explained by the presence of workers. Based on the nature of the tracks at the start of the trail, experts determined that Kobayashi was not running or trying to hold on. His stride was even and consistent with a normal gait. It did not resemble a situation where a person suddenly slips or loses his balance. The additional prints next to his did not form a clear line. They appeared fragmentarily and then disappeared, creating the impression that another person either walked sideways or moved across areas where the surface did not retain the pattern of the sole. This combination is usually encountered when moving on uneven surfaces, but here the areas with preserved tracks were located close enough to each other, making the complete disappearance of the prints difficult to explain. The search team noted that the pier's concrete was covered with a thin layer of algae and silt. On such a surface, traces were preserved only at a certain angle of loading, so the absence of some prints could be due to the peculiarities of the step. However, the coincidence of the directions of movement of two different pairs of shoes at several points forced us to consider the version of synchronous movement and not a random coincidence of old and new tracks. A check of nearby cameras showed that no one else had entered the pier area from the factory side that evening. meaning that the second person had either been there beforehand or had used an alternative access route. The company's service plans contained a reference to an old technical passage leading to the water from the warehouse area. This path was not used regularly and was not equipped with a surveillance system. An inspection of the passage revealed that the gates were not sealed and could be opened manually. No signs of forced entry or damage were recorded, indicating free access. At the same time, police checked Kobayashi's recent calls and messages. No conflicts or disturbing conversations were found, with the exception of a brief correspondence with an unknown number 2 days before the incident. The content of these messages has been partially preserved. They mentioned a place near the water and an exact time, but it was not possible to determine the context of the conversation. The telecom operator confirmed that the number belonged to prepaid tariffs and was used for a limited time. After the specified date, activity ceased completely. This scheme is not uncommon, but in combination with other circumstances, it looked like an element of a pre-planned action. The day after the disappearance, a search party inspected the waters around the pier. No signs of a fall into the water were found. The current at the time was weak and could not have carried the body away unnoticed. Divers checked the adjacent area of the seabed and found no fragments of clothing or personal belongings underwater, which reduced the likelihood of an accident on the water. The lack of finds in the water forced us to shift our focus to the area behind the pier, but there began a restricted access zone where the terrain changed sharply and transitioned into technical areas. According to archival documents, this area was used in the past to service underwater communications. It was later closed and no longer included in personnel maps. A comparison of the coordinates revealed that Kobayashi's phone's last known location was in close proximity to one of these objects, previously unmentioned in reports. The place was not visible from the main road and had no clear landmarks. It could only be reached via service paths. During the initial inspection of the area, investigators discovered footprints in the ground that did not match any of the pairs of shoes registered to the plant employees, indicating the presence of a third person. These tracks were located deeper in the area of old buildings and did not continue towards residential areas, which made the version of a random passerby unlikely. Further exploration of the area was complicated by the lack of lighting and the dense arrangement of structures. Many areas consisted of concrete platforms and metal stairs. Under these conditions, it became virtually impossible to reconstruct the exact sequence of movements, as the surface did not retain traces or was quickly erased by the effects of water. The search team recorded evidence of recent human presence at several sites, but was unable to determine their age or identity. In one of these places, a fragment of insulating tape was found that was not used in the standard equipment of the plant. The origin of the item remains unknown. This find was not included in the main report due to the lack of a direct connection to the disappearance, but it was retained in the case file as potentially significant. At the same time, Kobayashi's relatives reported that in recent weeks he had frequently looked through old maps of the coast and made notes that were not related to his main work. These records did not contain coordinates, but mentioned names of objects that were absent from modern maps, indicating that they were referring to outdated sources of information. Experts concluded that he may have been seeking access to infrastructure that had long since fallen out of official use, without realizing the real risks. Kobayashi's lack of appropriate equipment for a long stay in the technical zone cast doubt on the version of independent research. By this point, the investigation had effectively moved from analyzing a single disappearance to examining the entire hidden system of passages and objects around the old pier, which significantly expanded the scope of the case. After expanding the inspection area, the investigative team began comparing the discovered elements with the archives of previous contractors who worked on the coast before the reconstruction. These materials revealed references to temporary technical platforms not included in the current plans for the area. Some of these platforms were intended to service underwater communication lines and pumping stations. After the projects were completed, they were only partially dismantled. Access to them was formally closed, but physical passages remained. It was in the area of such objects that isolated traces of the presence of people who were not part of the plant's personnel were recorded. It was not possible to establish their origin using standard methods. Investigators noted that Kobayashi did not have official access to these archives, meaning the information could only have been obtained through third-party sources. A check of his personal contacts revealed that several weeks before his disappearance, he had been in contact with a man who had previously worked for a contractor that maintained the old pier. This contact was not recorded in the company's official logs and existed only on his personal phone. It was not possible to determine the content of the conversations. In parallel, searchers continued to survey the area along the coastline, but no fragments of clothing or personal belongings were found. The absence of such finds ruled out the possibility of a sudden incident occurring directly on the pier. Events would have developed differently and would not have left the usual markers. One internal report stated that the concrete platform surfaces could hide small objects due to unevenness and cracks, so some evidence could have been lost before the active search began. Despite this, none of the areas inspected showed signs of an emergency or struggle. Additional attention was paid to studying the time windows between the last phone recording and the start of the search. During this time, the pier area was unmonitored and remained accessible. The analysis revealed that several people could have passed through the technical passage during this period without reaching the camera zone. This factor had not previously been taken into account. This opened the possibility for the appearance of a third or even fourth participant in the events, which made the reconstruction even more difficult. The investigation team found that with such a large number of unknown variables, standard versions ceased to work. The reports included the term closed technical environment, which was used to describe the area where the events took place. This term referred to a territory that was formally decommissioned but physically accessible and uncontrolled. It is precisely this environment that could become a place where the usual methods of recording and searching prove useless. Conversations with former contractors revealed that some continued to use old passages for unofficial access to equipment even after the facilities were closed. These confessions did not contain a direct connection to the Kobayashi case, but they confirmed the very possibility of the presence of strangers in the pier area. At this stage, the investigation began to consider the possibility of an informal network of access to technical facilities on the coast. Verification of such connections was complicated by the fact that such activities were not reflected in documents and were not recorded by accounting systems. All contacts took place verbally and left no digital traces. In this context, Kobayashi's disappearance ceased to be an isolated event and became part of a broader pattern of unrecorded activity. However, the lack of concrete evidence did not allow this version to be considered the main one. The investigative team continued to work through archives and interview former employees, but most of them did not have the full picture. Each new piece of information added details, but did not answer the main question about Kobayashi's fate. Internal discussions increasingly touched on the idea that the key moment occurred outside the area accessible for inspection. This meant that the actual scene of events could be located deeper in the technical environment than originally assumed. This conclusion changed the investigative strategy, shifting the focus from the coastline to closed sites. However, without official plans and access to these sites, any further action remained limited. After the investigation finally focused on the closed technical zones around the old pier, attention shifted to reconstructing the entire system of passages and platforms previously used by contractors. To do this, they dug into the archives of construction companies and requested diagrams that had never been published in open sources. The analysis revealed that a network of temporary corridors existed along the coast, connecting pumping stations and communication hubs. These facilities were formally dismantled, but in reality their foundations and access roads continued to be used in a limited manner. These corridors could explain the appearance of traces of a third person and the disappearance of shoe prints in certain areas where the surface consisted of metal bars and concrete slabs. Investigators noted that such zones have unique acoustics and sound reflections, Conversations or footsteps can be perceived distortedly, creating the illusion of the presence or, conversely, the complete absence of people. A reinspection of several sites revealed that some of the fastenings and fencing had recently been moved, with wear patterns indicating regular use rather than accidental entry. These details were not included in the initial reports because the objects were considered irrelevant and of no interest to the standard investigation. At the same time, the police requested information about contractors who had worked on the pier in the past. It turned out that several firms had been dissolved and their documentation had been partially lost. This created a situation in which some information about the design of the facilities remained available only through oral testimony from former employees. One of these workers confirmed that in the area of the old pier, there were passages that allowed access to the water, bypassing the official paths. Only those who participated in the installation work knew about them. According to him, these passages continued to be used by individuals even after the project was closed, but no control was exercised over this. This information coincided with the theory that Kobayashi could have obtained information about the closed infrastructure through personal contact rather than through documents. However, it turned out to be impossible to establish the identity of such a contact. The number with which he corresponded disappeared from the network and left no digital trace. The investigative reports introduced the term hidden route, which refers to a system of passages not included in official maps, but still functional. Analyzing Kobayashi's behavior, experts concluded that he was moving along precisely this route. His actions did not appear random and were not consistent with the behavior of a person in an unfamiliar area. At the same time, the lack of supplies and means of communication cast doubt on the version of independent research. He clearly did not expect to stay in a technical environment for a long time. This contradiction between awareness and minimal preparation remained one of the central mysteries of the case. The investigative team noted that this is possible if a person expected to meet someone along the route or was counting on being accompanied. However, no witnesses confirmed the meeting in the pier area that evening, and cameras and eyewitnesses did not record the presence of other people. The lack of confirmation did not mean the event did not occur. In the area of the old objects, surveillance was minimal, and a significant part of the territory remained out of sight. Over time, it became clear that key events occurred precisely in this blind spot, where traditional methods of search and control do not work. Internal discussions increasingly focused on how closed technical areas could remain in active use without attracting the attention of the authorities. This led to a reconsideration of views on coastal security and the recognition of the existence of parallel infrastructure. Kobayashi's case has gradually evolved from a private disappearance into a telling story about the risks associated with abandoned properties. However, the fate of Kobayashi himself remained unknown. No elements found allowed us to draw a conclusion about what happened after entering the hidden route. The investigative team noted that with access to complete schematics of the technical environment, it might be possible to narrow the search area. However, such schematics were not available at the time. This meant that the investigation had reached a dead end, not due to lack of effort, but due to objective limitations of information. Official documents continued to use cautious wording without specifying a specific version of what happened. Each new report only confirmed the complexity of the situation and the lack of a breakthrough. The story of Kobayashi's disappearance became increasingly multi-layered and went beyond the scope of standard search cases. By this point, it became clear that without fundamentally new data, it was impossible to reconstruct the chain of events. After the existence of the hidden routes was acknowledged, the investigative team's attention was directed toward attempting to determine their actual status at the time of Kobayashi's disappearance, using testimony from former contractors and rare technical reports that had survived in paper form. A comparison of these data showed that some of the facilities were not completely dismantled. Some nodes and corridors remained physically accessible, although they were formally considered decommissioned. These elements did not fall under the responsibility of any active unit, which explained the lack of regular inspection and recording of what was happening. The case materials emphasized that such zones actually existed outside the legal framework. They were not considered dangerous and did not require fencing. This situation created the conditions for the informal use of the objects as temporary passages or access points to the coastline. Analysis of photographs from the inspection site revealed signs of recent wear on the metal structures that could not have appeared as a result of natural processes. Experts noted that the nature of the abrasions indicates regular contact with shoes and equipment, rather than a one-off incident. These details suggested that the area of the old pier continued to be used for practical purposes and was not abandoned in the full sense of the word. In this regard, investigators began to consider the possibility that Kobayashi was not there by chance, but was acting as part of an informal interaction with the technical environment. The absence of his personal belongings on the surface indicated that his further movements took place in places where inspection was difficult or impossible. Additional difficulties were created by the lack of precise diagrams of underwater communications. Some of the data dated back to the period when documentation was kept manually. One report mentioned an underground sewer running into the area of the old pier, which was used to service the pumps and was not shown on modern maps. A check of this information revealed that access to the collector could have been achieved through a hatch located several meters from the last recorded point of Kobayashi's phone. The hatch was closed but not sealed, and no signs of forced entry were found, although the condition of the fastenings indicated that it had been opened relatively recently. This discovery became one of the few material elements that could be connected with subsequent events. Despite this, exploration of the collector was limited for safety reasons. The interior was a complex network of narrow passages. Experts indicated that without precise diagrams and equipment, a full inspection was impossible, which effectively closed this line of investigation. Internal reports again documented the impasse, with key areas beyond available search methods. Each new piece of information only confirmed the existence of a hidden layer of infrastructure that was not taken into account in standard procedures. As a result, the investigation gradually lost momentum and entered a waiting phase. However, the case was not officially closed. It remained on the list of unsolved disappearances. The analytical reports emphasized that Kobayashi's disappearance is an example of the complex interaction between humans and an abandoned technical environment. The lack of final conclusions was seen not as an investigative error, but as a reflection of objective limitations. Nevertheless, interest in the case remained, and it was periodically returned to when examining unusual cases. These analyses did not yield new facts, but they did allow us to keep the problem of closed zones in focus. In the context of the Hitotsubashi coast, this meant rethinking the relationship with old objects. However, without a specific incident of similar magnitude, changes did not occur. Kobayashi's story continued to remain in the archives as an example of a situation without a logical conclusion. The case materials gradually became a source for analytical research, but not for operational actions. At this stage, the investigation finally moved into the category of cases that live in documents rather than in real search operations. After the case entered the archival stage, the investigative bodies continued to periodically update the materials, primarily through comparisons with other disappearances in coastal areas, which made it possible to identify common features and typical problems of searching in areas of old infrastructure. The comparison showed that in a number of cases, people also went beyond the official routes and found themselves in technical spaces that were not monitored by surveillance systems. These spaces had one thing in common. They were not formally considered dangerous, but in fact they were complex environments with many hidden passages and levels. Analysts noted that such zones create a false sense of security, especially for people who have partial information about the design of objects. In Kobayashi's case, this was evident in his confident demeanor on the closed route, showing no signs of doubt or haste. His lack of emergency communications and special equipment continued to look like a deliberate risk that was difficult to explain without the assumption of external support. However, in none of the compared cases was it possible to identify a confirmed pattern of interaction between the missing persons and third parties. This indicated that even when conditions were similar, each situation retained unique elements. The reports emphasized that when analyzing such cases, it is necessary to take into account not only geography, but also the social environment. In particular, informal connections between former employees of contracting organizations and local residents were examined. Such connections are rarely documented but can play a key role in disseminating information about closed facilities. In Kobayashi's case, it was not possible to establish direct contact with such groups, but indirect signs indicated a possible intersection of interests. An analysis of his correspondence and notes revealed several references to objects that did not appear in official sources. These references were not systematic and did not allow the route to be reconstructed, but they confirmed his awareness. Internal discussions gradually shifted from the question of Kobayashi's whereabouts to the question of how he gained access to restricted knowledge. This shift reflected the understanding that without identifying the source of information, the reconstruction of events would remain incomplete. Oral recommendations, personal meetings, and informal consultations were considered as possible channels. All these forms of interaction leave no documentary traces and are practically not amenable to retrospective analysis. This created a situation in which, even with a large amount of data collected, a key element remained inaccessible. The investigative team has determined that further progress is only possible if new evidence emerges from outside. In the absence of such evidence, the case continued to exist in a state of suspense. Periodic inspections of the area revealed no changes. The infrastructure continued to deteriorate and lose its bearings. Over time, the ability to reconstruct an accurate picture of events decreased due to the destruction of objects. This made the Kobayashi case not only unsolved, but also gradually receding into the realm of hypothesis. The reports noted that every lost detail reduced the chance of clarifying the circumstances. However, the investigation was not formally closed and remained open. The story continued to be seen as an example of the complex interaction between humans and abandoned environments. For many experts, it became an illustration of how the boundaries of responsibility between departments can create blind spots. These zones are not physically isolated, but remain informationally out of sight. As a result, Kobayashi's disappearance continued to remain an unsolved mystery in official documents. Over time, the Kobayashi case materials began to be used as a teaching example for search units, with particular emphasis on the fact that in areas with old infrastructure, conventional recording methods prove useless. Metal decks and concrete platforms do not retain fingerprints and allow a person to move around without leaving any visible traces. Analytical reviews have emphasized that such spaces create blind spots where constant monitoring and surveillance are lacking. It is in such places that events can unfold unnoticed, even with a large number of services involved. Unlike typical incidents, it was not possible to determine the moment of transition from a normal route to a critical situation, which deprived the investigation of a key reference point and made it impossible to reconstruct the sequence of actions. The investigative team repeatedly returned to attempts to find this boundary, but each time they were faced with the fact that material evidence was either absent or had been lost due to the destruction of objects. One report noted that the plant's security system was concentrated on production areas, while older technical zones were not considered a priority and were practically unmonitored. This distribution of attention explained why Kobayashi's possible movements after reaching the pier remained out of sight. Most of his route could have taken place on surfaces where it was impossible to preserve traces. Experts emphasized that the absence of data in such conditions cannot be interpreted as the absence of an event. It is merely an indicator of the limitations of the recording tools. This understanding led to a theoretical revision of a number of approaches, but formal changes in the regulations never followed. Kobayashi's case remained listed as an unsolved disappearance with no evidence of foul play, reducing its priority in resource allocation. For the investigative team, this meant that active action was only possible when new information emerged from outside, but the likelihood of this diminished over time. Reports noted that the destruction of old structures gradually destroys potential evidence, even that which might have survived the initial inspections. This process was unnoticeable but inevitable, with each month decreasing the chance of finding anything suitable for analysis. For the Kobayashi family, the uncertainty became increasingly difficult, with official responses containing no new information and merely confirming that the case remained open. This situation did not allow for a conclusion and at the same time did not give grounds for hope for a quick clarification of the circumstances. Analytical reports noted that such stories eventually become archival. They continue to exist in documents but lose their operational significance. However, they are the ones that identify systemic problems in the organization of control over technical areas. Kobayashi's disappearance has become one of the arguments in favor of recognizing that abandoned infrastructure represents an independent risk factor. However, even this understanding did not lead to real changes in relation to old objects on the coast. As a result, the story remained unfinished, lacking both a factual ending and a formal explanation. With each passing year, the case was increasingly perceived as an example of how a person could disappear without leaving the known territory. The investigation materials continued to be stored in the archive and were periodically used for educational purposes without introducing new facts. However, none of the working hypotheses were confirmed. The lack of evidence made it impossible to move from assumptions to conclusions. This was the main feature of the Kobayashi case. The logic of events was violated at the very center of the story. Everything that happened after reaching the old pier remained hidden from observation and analysis. This secrecy was formed not by external intervention, but by the very structure of the space. The investigative team increasingly pointed to the role of the environment as a key factor in its findings. This approach shifted the focus from the identity of the missing person to the features of the surrounding infrastructure. However, such a shift did not bring us any closer to answering the main question. The disappearance at the old pier remains an event without a recorded sequel. After the case finally entered the archival phase, analytical units continued to use it as a basis for studying unusual disappearances, with particular attention paid to the combination of human factors and the peculiarities of the technical environment that can conceal events from any form of surveillance. The training materials emphasized that closed zones do not physically disappear even after the official dismantling of the facilities. They continue to exist as fragments of infrastructure and temporary passages that remain passable. It is these fragments that form an alternative space within the familiar environment. A person can end up there accidentally or intentionally, but after that, their movement becomes practically invisible. In the context of Kobayashi's disappearance, this meant that even precise knowledge of the last recorded point does not provide an understanding of the further development of events. The investigative team noted that without taking such zones into account, any search operations are doomed to be incomplete from the start. However, formal procedures rarely include analysis of abandoned infrastructure unless there are direct signs of an incident. As a result, many cases end without identifying key factors that could shed light on the circumstances of the disappearance. The Kobayashi case studies have become an example of how formal completeness does not mean a real understanding of the situation. The lack of a finale made it impossible to close the topic even at an analytical level. Each new analysis returned specialists to the same limitations. Over time, the story ceased to be perceived as an isolated incident and became part of a general body of data on unusual events. This made it possible to identify recurring features associated with technical zones in coastal and industrial areas. These signs included the lack of video monitoring, unstable communication, and the presence of passages not shown in the documentation. All these elements were also present in the area of the old Hitotsubashi Pier. Thus, the environment in which Kobayashi found himself ceased to be considered a secondary factor. On the contrary, it became the key to understanding why his path ended in this particular place. However, without access to the hidden layers of infrastructure, this understanding remained theoretical. The investigative team determined that further progress is only possible with a comprehensive review of approaches to such territories. Such revisions require not only resources, but also political will, which was not forthcoming in this case. As a result, history continued to exist as a collection of documents and analytical conclusions. For the Kobayashi family, this meant no real prospect of getting answers. Official formulations continued to use cautious expressions that did not allow for either closing the case or providing a clear explanation. This uncertainty has become an integral part of the whole story. It reflected not so much the investigative errors as the limitations of existing control systems. Internal reviews highlighted that even with maximum efforts, part of the environment remains unmonitored. In Kobayashi's case, it was this part that played a decisive role. However, it was not possible to determine what exactly happened within this zone. All subsequent attempts to return to the case materials did not yield any new data. History gradually lost its operational significance but retained its analytical value. It continued to be used as an argument for changing attitudes towards abandoned infrastructure. However, until now, the case remained unfinished, and the main question remained unanswered. Over time, the story of Kobayashi's disappearance has come to be seen as an indicator of the vulnerability of coastal industrial areas, where formal infrastructure coexists with fragments of older facilities, these fragments forming an alternative environment of movement that few are aware of and that is almost impossible to control. Analytical reports emphasized that such zones create a false sense of order. Outwardly, the territory appears explored, but in practice it contains numerous transitions and hidden levels. In Kobayashi's case, it was precisely this difference between the apparent structure and the actual arrangement of space that became the decisive factor. The investigative team repeatedly returned to the question of why he went exactly to where the surveillance zone ended. It was not possible to give a clear answer to this question due to the lack of a source of information about closed routes. All working versions agreed on one thing: he did not end up in this area by accident. His behavior before going out onto the pier indicated confidence and a lack of doubt. This ruled out an impulsive decision and strengthened the theory of prior knowledge of the route. However, confirmation of this knowledge was never obtained. The lack of evidence forced us to consider what was happening exclusively from an analytical perspective. Internal reports noted that it was precisely these gaps in the data that made it impossible to reconstruct the full picture. Even with dozens of indirect signs, the key element remained hidden. This made the Kobayashi case an example of how the technical environment can absorb an event without leaving a clear trace. Analysts emphasize that such cases are not necessarily linked to crime. Often, they are the result of a combination of human decisions and the characteristics of the space. In the context of the old Hitotsubashi Pier, this combination proved fatal. Over time, attention to the case waned, but it continued to appear in reviews. Every new mention of the Kobayashi case in analytical reports was accompanied by the same questions about where exactly the key event occurred and why standard search methods proved useless. Experts returned to these materials again and again, but did not find elements in them that could change the overall picture. Over time, the lack of answers ceased to be perceived as a temporary state. It became a permanent characteristic of the case. Reports increasingly emphasized that the available volume of data did not allow for the transition from hypotheses to testable versions. As a result, the story of the disappearance was entrenched in the archives as unresolved. It did not have the status of closed, but it also did not move forward, remaining in an intermediate state between investigation and documented chronicle. The case materials were used primarily to identify systemic problems in the organization of control over technical areas. They served as an illustration of how abandoned sites can fall outside the scope of services. The analytical reviews emphasized that these materials indicate the need to take old infrastructure into account when planning search operations, especially in coastal and industrial areas. However, despite these conclusions, no practical steps were taken in this direction. The recommendations remained at the theoretical level and were not transformed into changes to regulations. This state of affairs left the possibility of similar situations recurring. Experts noted that without a revision of approaches, similar disappearances could continue to occur in the future. Kobayashi's disappearance gradually became part of a larger professional theme about how human decisions collide with environmental factors and lead to unpredictable consequences. This topic was considered not in the context of a specific individual, but as an example of human interaction with space that is not subject to complete control. In the absence of new information, the case remained frozen. Formally, it continued to be listed as open, but in fact, there was no progress. It was neither closed nor developed, which created a special status in which the investigation exists only in the form of documents and analytical commentary. This duality has accompanied the case for a long time, with each passing year reinforcing the feeling that key events have forever remained outside the field of observation. The story never reached its final point. The disappearance on the old pier remained an event without a fixed continuation and without the possibility of a logical conclusion. Over time, experts came to the conclusion that Kobayashi's disappearance should not be viewed as an isolated incident, but as a manifestation of the systemic vulnerability of coastal industrial areas, where old infrastructure remains physically accessible but has lost control and documentation. Analytical materials noted that such zones form an alternative environment within a formally ordered space. A person can remain in it for an extended period of time, while remaining outside the scope of video surveillance and standard accounting procedures. This leads to a situation in which the disappearance is recorded only by indirect signs and is not accompanied by clear markers of events, which completely changes the nature of the investigation and deprives it of its usual reference points. In the context of the old Hitotsubashi Pier, such an environment had existed for decades without being perceived as a risk, as evidenced by the lack of regular inspections and system reports. The investigative team found that prior to Kobayashi's disappearance, such areas were viewed solely as a backdrop for the main infrastructure rather than as an active factor in potential incidents. This approach changed only after attempts to find a logical breakpoint in the route finally failed, and the standard versions stopped working. Recognizing the role of the environment did not lead to the emergence of new evidence, but it allowed us to reinterpret the data already collected and identify their limitations. Analysts concluded that Kobayashi was able to navigate a space that defied the logic of open territories and was not captured by existing systems. Such a space is characterized by multiple levels, a lack of visual landmarks, and transitions that cannot be reconstructed after the fact. Even having the coordinates of the phone's last signal did not give a real idea of its further path and possible stopping points. Internal reports emphasized that without access to full technical schematics and actual exploration of the hidden corridors, any further investigation remains hypothetical. However, access to these schemes was lost as a result of reorganizations and liquidation of contractors, which finally closed this line of analysis. As a result, the Kobayashi case became an example of how the destruction of documentation can play a decisive role in the loss of information. Over time, interest in the case remained primarily in the professional community and in educational programs for search units. For the general public, the story gradually dissolved into a mass of unresolved disappearances that remained unexplored. At the same time, analytical reviews continued to mention it as one of the most illustrative cases of interaction between humans and abandoned environments. These mentions did not lead to a resumption of active actions, but allowed the topic to be kept within the professional field. The investigative team noted that even years later, it is impossible to form a reliable version of events without new data. The lack of material evidence remained an insurmountable barrier to any review of the case. Thus, the investigation finally lost the prospect of active development and became an archival matter. The materials continued to be stored unchanged and were used solely for analytical purposes. Each new revision only confirmed the previously made conclusions and the lack of progress. None of the theories put forward during the investigation were ever confirmed. Each of them relied solely on circumstantial evidence and assumptions, making it impossible to form a coherent picture of events and preventing the translation of analytical conclusions into practical action. The persistence of such uncertainty became a characteristic feature of the entire case, reflected in official documents through cautious wording and a lack of definitive conclusions, which over time turned the investigation into a formal procedure without any real progress. The story existed in a state of persistent incompleteness. It was neither closed nor developed, which created a special archival status in which the case materials were stored without the prospect of active renewal. This situation was seen by experts as a reflection of structural problems in the control of coastal areas, where old infrastructure continues to physically exist but is effectively excluded from the oversight system. The analytical reports emphasized that such zones required a separate approach, but the lack of resources and a single point of responsibility made the implementation of changes impossible. All these factors together created conditions under which Kobayashi's disappearance remained not only unsolved, but also methodologically insoluble within the framework of existing procedures. Internal reviews have noted that even with a complete chronology of actions up to the pier, the rest of the route remains an empty space without events. It was precisely this gap between the known and the unknown that became the main result of the whole story. Disappearance remained a point without continuation. After multiple reviews of the case materials, experts concluded that Kobayashi's disappearance cannot be viewed as an isolated incident. A combination of the old coastal infrastructure and human behavior created conditions in which key events were completely hidden from observation and left no verifiable traces. Analytical reviews emphasized that closed technical zones create an alternative environment within the familiar urban space. A person can be within the official territory, but still fall outside the scope of all existing control and registration mechanisms. This leads to a situation in which the disappearance is recorded only based on the latest indirect data, after which the investigation loses its footing and is forced to work not with actions, but with assumptions about the properties of the environment. In the case of the old Hitotsubashi Pier, this is precisely what happened. The last recorded route point did not provide any understanding of where and under what circumstances the transition from normal movement to a critical event occurred. The investigative team has repeatedly pointed out that without taking into account hidden corridors and abandoned objects, any search operations remain incomplete and do not cover the entire possible area of development of events. However, the current regulations did not provide for such an expansion of the area of responsibility and did not formally allow work with facilities that had been decommissioned many years ago. As a result, the investigation continued to exist within the framework of outdated models that did not reflect the actual structure of the territory and did not produce practical results. This contradiction between formal schemes and the actual environment became increasingly obvious as analytical materials accumulated. Despite this, the review of procedures was never carried out, and the Kobayashi case remained an example of a systemic impasse in the work with technical zones. The materials on the disappearance continued to be stored in the archive without movement and without the emergence of new data capable of changing the overall picture. Internal reports indicated that the Kobayashi case gradually lost its operational status and became more of an analytical matter, viewed as material for studying the risks associated with abandoned infrastructure rather than as a target for active search efforts. With each subsequent revision, specialists again encountered the fact that the main gaps were connected not with a lack of effort, but with the very structure of the territory, which did not lend itself to full description and control. Under such conditions, even a complete reconstruction of his route to the old pier did not provide an understanding of what happened next and where the key point of events could have been. Analysts noted that it is precisely this gap between the known and the unknown that makes Kobayashi's disappearance particularly revealing for assessing the system's vulnerabilities. The case materials were used to identify patterns in similar incidents that occurred in industrial and coastal areas. Comparison with other cases showed that the presence of closed technical zones is almost always accompanied by a lack of clear traces and the inability to localize the moment of the incident. These conclusions did not lead to changes in practice. They remained within the framework of expert discussions and were not included in regulations. As a result, experts acknowledged that existing approaches do not correspond to the actual structure of the environment. For the Kobayashi family, this meant that, as time went on, the prospects for answers became increasingly elusive. History continued to exist in documents and reports, but not in the form of active actions aimed at its completion. The analysis emphasized that the Kobayashi case has, over time, come to be seen as an example of the systemic vulnerability of coastal areas, where old infrastructure retains a physical presence but has completely lost control and management. Experts noted that such zones form a parallel space within a formally safe environment. A person can remain there for an extended period of time while remaining outside of all the usual fixation mechanisms. This explained why the disappearance was not accompanied by alarm signals and left no traces that could be used for an active search. The report stated that closed facilities should be considered not as a background but as an independent risk factor. However, at the time of Kobayashi's disappearance, such an approach was absent. Responsibility for the old technical zones was diffused between departments and effectively belonged to no one. This created conditions in which the movements of people in such places remained unnoticed. Even with cameras in place on the main premises, the plant did not monitor its outlying areas. As a result, a significant portion of Kobayashi's route was outside the security service's purview. Analysts pointed out that this situation is typical not only for Hitotsubashi, but also for many industrial towns. This allowed the case to be viewed not as a local incident, but as a symptom of a broader problem. However, the conclusions remained within the framework of professional discussions and did not lead to reforms. The case materials continued to be used in training programs for search units, where they were used to analyze errors related to the underestimation of abandoned objects and the lack of control over technical zones. Experts noted that it is precisely these areas that create conditions in which disappearances are recorded based on indirect evidence and then become impossible to reconstruct. Analytical analyses emphasized that closed infrastructure does not disappear after dismantling. It persists in the form of platform collector crossings and service corridors, which remain physically accessible while being excluded from the metering system. This environment creates a parallel space within the city, where conventional monitoring mechanisms are ineffective. In Kobayashi's case, this environment became a key element of the entire story. His route to the old pier was reconstructed using cameras and indirect data, but after entering the area of the old objects, surveillance ceased, and the rest of the route turned into an empty space with no traces or confirmed events. The investigative team repeatedly noted that the lack of material finds made it impossible to pinpoint the turning point. It was impossible to determine whether the critical event occurred immediately at the pier or deeper in the technical zone. Each version ran into the same problem. The space left no verifiable markers and provided no points for reference. Over time, the destruction of objects intensified this effect. Concrete platforms crumbled, metal corroded, passages changed shape. Under such conditions, even with repeated surveys, the area became less recognizable, and the likelihood of finding anything suitable for analysis decreased with each season. For the family of the missing man, this meant a gradual loss of hope for a clear answer. Official notifications contained no new facts and only confirmed that the case remained open. The investigation was formally ongoing, but in reality, it existed in the form of documents and rare inspections without any real progress. Within the departments, the story ceased to be news and was relegated to the archives, but its significance as an example of a systemic problem did not diminish. Specialists continued to cite it when discussing the risks associated with technical zones and the blurring of responsibilities between agencies. These discussions showed that Kobayashi's disappearance could not be explained by a single cause. but was the result of a combination of a human decision to enter a closed route and the existence of an environment where there was no control, a combination that made the case persistently intractable within the framework of standard procedures. The analytical materials emphasized that such stories are important, not only because of the tragedy of a specific person, but also because they reveal the weaknesses of a system where territory exists physically, but legally and organizationally, it remains no one's property. In this sense, the disappearance at the old pier became a reminder of the hidden vulnerabilities of the environment. It occurred within the boundaries of a well-known city, near an operating enterprise, yet still remained without a final point and without a verifiable explanation. Over time, experts noted that such disappearances rarely become the subject of public attention unless they are accompanied by obvious signs of a crime. In Kobayashi's case, the lack of such signs led to the story gradually losing its resonance and remaining within the realm of professional discussion. Internal reports indicated that, in the absence of public and media pressure, the review of procedures was postponed indefinitely, so that even identified systemic problems continued to exist without any attempts to address them. This created a vicious circle in which each new disappearance in the technical zone confirmed old conclusions, but did not become a reason for change. Analysts emphasized that such inertia is typical for structures where responsibility is distributed among several departments, and none of them has complete control over the territory. In the area of the old Hitotsubashi Pier, this is precisely the model that developed. Formally, the area belonged to the plant, but in fact, it was not serviced or inspected. This gap between the formal status and the actual state of the space became one of the reasons why the disappearance turned out to be insoluble. The case materials continued to be used as an illustration of how the environment can absorb an event without leaving a trace. At the same time, experts acknowledged that without access to the full infrastructure, similar stories would repeat themselves. Analytical reviews emphasized that old objects require a separate approach and cannot be considered as a neutral background. However, until now, these conclusions have remained only on paper and have not led to real action. Kobayashi's story gradually became part of the internal professional culture of the search units, cited as an example of how, even with the resources and formal procedures in place, an investigation can reach a dead end due to environmental factors and the loss of control over peripheral areas. The training sessions emphasized that coastal technical zones have their own logic of existence. They may appear abandoned, but still retain functional elements that are used informally and are not recorded in reports. It was precisely this duality of the environment that explained why the disappearance occurred not on the outskirts of the world, but within the confines of a working town, next to an operating enterprise and residential areas. The lack of a finale was not due to a lack of effort, but to systemic limitations when working with such territories. The internal conclusion was that without a review of approaches to the old infrastructure, such cases will continue to accumulate. However, even this understanding did not lead to real changes. History remained a warning that was never heeded. For the Kobayashi family, the disappearance remained forever an event without explanation and without any way to put a logical end to it. So the case of the old Hitotsubashi Pier ended not with a finale, but with the silence of archival documents that only record that a man entered a closed route and never returned.